Are you dreaming about travelling again? I bet you are. So give yourself a break and listen to my brand new travel podcast. It's made for people like you, by people like you. And in these podcasts, there will be interviews with different types of travellers and the strange characters that I've met on the road, with stories and anecdotes from the last 32 years of my continuous backpacking and working around the world. Also, there'll be cynical destination descriptions and the occasional travel tip to smooth your journey. And for all the squeamish listeners out there, I just want to say that no studio was used or abused in the making of these podcasts or any of the recordings. So please check it out, and I hope you like it. Oh, and by the way, my name's Alan. Hi. While making this recording, I just didn't realise it was going to take so long and be so detailed. So here is part 1 of possibly 2 and 3 episodes. I apologise for the gang of chirping sparrows that invaded this recording in the beginning. Thank you. If you haven't listened to last week's episode and how and where I got locked down in Spain, please go back and check it out. And this episode is about my 3 months lockdown in La Casa Los Dioses, halfway through the walk. From here on, I will simply use La Casa to describe La Casa de los Dioses, as I find it difficult to pronounce. And before I get into the story itself, of what life was like there, I just want to say that this recording, this podcast, is only an account of how I personally saw things, the people's behaviour, their attitudes, and describe a little about their characters during my 3 months. And I'm not judging anybody here, because it's possible that some people acted differently due to the situation they found themselves in. And Galya and I were the only 2 true pilgrims that stayed throughout the whole lockdown period. All the other people were Camino hobos and vagabonds who permanently walked or cycled the Caminos around Spain and Portugal. We all thought we'd only be there for a couple of weeks, and then it was extended to a month, and then 2 more weeks, and then 2 more weeks. The government kept extending the lockdown, and it created a lot of disappointment and resentment with everybody. And strangely enough, we were all solo travellers and free independent spirits who ended up being locked up together. Nobody wanted to be there, and we were all like caged tigers. I'd have been a lot happier still walking to my destination of Santiago. And David, who ran the place, said he'd never had so many people stay for so long in the history of La Casa. And even before the end of the 3 months, it was telling on us. The tensions began to show. It was getting to all of us, on everybody, even me. At the very start, Galya and I offered to pay for our stay, but David refused. His whole philosophy was that he was providing an oasis, a place of rest, some drink and food to the weary pilgrims on their way past, free of charge. David often said that he didn't understand the pilgrim's consternation when he wouldn't take payment for the drinks or snacks. But to me, it was as clear as the nose on his face. It's because we all come from a world, a society where nothing is free. Not even our words, which can cost us dearly in these times of social media. And even our leisure time is used to create revenue for some people. As I say, nothing is free, as someone always ends up paying in the end. And what we should all try and do in our lives, and this is important with regards to this story, is to make sure we do the right thing for the right reason, and not the right thing for the wrong reason. And I'll give you a simple example of that. To give money or food to a homeless person so it makes you look good is the wrong reason. The right reason is to give because that person needs it and it will improve their life. Okay, story time. Let me start by describing the area around La Casa. I'll set the scene for those who have never been there or never seen it. La Casa is in the countryside on a hilltop about 3 kilometres from the nearest village, the village of St. Justo de Viga, and 7 kilometres from the nearest city, Astorga, to the west. And to the east even further, but there was a petrol station 4 kilometres away on the main road to the south, which will feature very heavily later on. La Casa is surrounded by woodland, and the fields around there grow rye and barley, and the wildlife was absolutely awesome. Especially for me, it was the best thing during my time there. The original building was an old goat shed. It had been painted out and a gravel floor put down inside. Heavy blankets covered the doorway to keep the cold out and the warmth in, as it had a wood-burning stove. And against the back wall were trestles with the food on to keep it off the floor. In the front garden there was a lean-to with a couple of hammocks hanging up. There was a small building right on the side of the Camino itself, a 3-sided shack with seats and another wood-burning stove, where we all sat for hours contemplating life and the lockdown. We didn't even have running water there, so we had to walk a kilometre to the freshwater spring down in the valley with our empty 6-litre containers, fill them and carry them back up the hill. Our toilet was anywhere in the surrounding woodlands and fields where you felt comfortable to expose yourself to nature. But much, much more about that later on. And no kitchen as such. We cooked on the wood-burning stoves. And at the beginning, David and Galya did most of the cooking, using the stove in the goat shed. At first, when we got there, David had some very strict rules. For example, there was no cooking allowed on the front stove in the shack by the Camino. And he insisted in washing up the dishes because he had a special system. And no alcohol on the premises. There was no smoking in the shack. These rules were relaxed as time went on. And no fixed shower, but what they used to do was hang sheets up in the goat shed, and water would be heated on the stove, then you'd pour it over yourself with a cup or a tin. I quickly came to the conclusion that this wasn't really going to be any problem staying here, given the conditions and the facilities. But I wasn't so sure when it came to the people, and the time I had to spend with them. It's the people that I might find difficult to cope with. And as far as this type of situation, well, I'm no stranger to long periods of isolation, having spent 11 months camping in the Sahara Desert on my own. I've been a bushcrafter and an old-school survivalist since I was a young kid, and I'm a real country boy. Because us country folk see things very differently. Whether it's the trees, the animals, the birds, the plants, rivers, even the wind and the rain, the smells, the seasons, we see everything very differently from someone who was born in the city. When I was originally shown the goat shed and my place to sleep, there was nowhere to hang my hammock. I was offered a mattress, but I saw an abandoned camp bed and used that instead. Also, Francis slept in the goat shed, his mattress right next to the wood-burning fire. And Galya's tent, the Bulgarian pilgrim, was further back, opposite the door. David slept right on the Camino, at the front, in a type of bed built up on a slightly raised platform, with heavy curtains around it, which were usually tied back and open to all the elements. Those early days were peaceful. For about the first 3 weeks there was only 4 of us, a good time to reflect and take short walks into the woods and surrounding fields, observe nature and wildlife, and going down to collect water in the morning was a good time to see the new animal tracks that had been made overnight in the soft mud and listen to the different bird songs. We were lucky. Lockdown could have been a lot worse. David seemed genuine enough, but it wasn't long before I realised Francis was a master manipulator, and I had only been there a couple of hours when they started suggesting I sent all my friends a message asking for money. They videoed me sitting between them in the shack and asked to say how these guys had given me food and drink. And to be honest, I was a bit like a rabbit at night caught in a car's headlights. I didn't want to be disrespectful, so I did the video, but I'm not stupid or gullible. I told them I didn't belong to any social media groups or Camino pilgrim groups, no travel groups, not anyone. In fact, I said I was very antisocial and I didn't like people. That's why I always travelled solo and walked on my own. They couldn't understand it, and they went from frantic excitement to bewildered despair. So if you ever come across a short video of me, you'll see the strange look on my face. Well, now you know why. David, on the other hand, was a reformed addict and had found God along the way. He was still forging his way to finding the meaning of his life and the contentment that goes with it. Most days were spent huddled around the wood-burning fire in the shack by the Camino to keep warm. Galya, who I first met in Burgos, had a great knack of modifying things to make them better. For example, she took a really cheap, basic and uncomfortable backpack and transformed it into exactly what she wanted. And she would always do her washing and get washed herself in the cold water spring down in the valley. It's on the side of the Camino, but the water was icy cold, and I'm not quite sure how she did that on those early mornings. And most days she'd disappear for the day, returning later in the evening, having gone walkabout. For me, each day started more or less the same. I'd wake around 7:30, and either quietly make my way into the woods, or I'd go straight across to the shack and make myself a coffee, where David would have rekindled the stove and be just chilling, usually deep in his own thoughts. Cleanliness and hygiene are very important to me, especially when you're living like this. So every morning, after enough water had been boiled for coffee, I heated up a big pan to use for shaving and washing myself, which was something I did every day. Galya was about early too, and the three of us would sit, keeping warm by the stove and drinking coffee. Breakfast could be bizcocho, it's a bit like a sponge cake, or biscuits, or a couple of bananas, or even cold boiled eggs from the day before. I sat in the shack watching the wildlife through the window. There were plenty of hawks and rat-catching buzzards soaring overhead looking for their breakfast, and plenty of noisy sparrows coming into the shack for crumbs, and occasionally you'd see rabbits or a deer in the fields. Francis would join us later. He was usually on his laptop late into the night, most nights, and he had a different timetable than us. As soon as lockdown kicked in on March 15th, all pilgrims disappeared overnight. The Camino became deserted. Not even locals came past from the village, and the main road in the distance was almost empty of traffic. And our only visitors would be the local police or the Guardia Civil. One day we saw someone in the distance along the Camino struggling to push a bicycle up the hill. By now, it was a really strange sight to see anybody on the Camino. David greeted the stranger warmly, who was apparently a well-known Portuguese carver who constantly travelled along the Caminos looking for work. David had never met him before, but he knew of him and his work in the churches along the way. And his name was Carlos, the carpenter, about 55 years old at a rough guess. And the police were the reason he turned up at La Casa. They caught him a couple of times on the Camino and they'd threatened him with an €800 fine or jail time. David set to and made him his own personal space at the other end of the lean-to, using blankets stapled to the wooden posts. He was used to sleeping outside because of his hobo lifestyle, but he saw this as luxury. He spent days telling us about what happened to him in his life, and he was an old-school nature lover, with the enthusiasm of a naughty 14-year-old boy. He said he would take eggs or young baby birds from the nest and raise them himself, and he once had a royal owl as a pet, a large bird that sat on his shoulder as he walked the Camino. He gained a lot of attention when he had it, but finally it was confiscated by the police. By his own admission, was no stranger when it came to the police, telling us of run-ins he had with them in the past. He told us that when he got drunk, he was uncontrollable. He never remembered what he'd done, but he'd always end up in the police station. Carlos fitted in easily without too much disruption into the group, and life at La Casa continued as normal. Well, for the next week at least. But by now, little by little, my patience with Francis was running out. So I tried to keep out of his way. Self-centred and manipulative, he seemed to be trying to control everybody, and like all con men, he was nice and charming with it. He was almost forcing people to make propaganda videos asking for money and food and posting them on social media. Galya's video ended up on the news in Bulgaria. And once, when David and Francis were talking in the shack, they both admitted that they would never work for money. They thought that was for fools. About a week later, another cycling hobo from the Camino turned up, and once again instructed by the Guardia Civil. Paco, a colourful character, a Spanish gypsy with a criminal history and proud of it, was around about 57, 58, more or less the same as Carlos. He was a middle-aged man with the body of a teenager. He still had long hair in the style from his heydays of the 80s, but now it was almost grey. Famed for robbing banks years earlier, and as he tells it, he shot a policeman and dragged his body behind his Mercedes. He was finally caught as the police chased him down, when he crashed his car and went through the windscreen. And after a long spell in hospital, after breaking lots of bones in his body, he was jailed for 13 years, he told us. So you'd assume he could cope well with being locked down in La Casa. Fearless and aggressive, you'd think. Well, you'd be wrong. From the moment he arrived, he continuously moaned and complained. Nothing was ever right, ever. And every day, he said he'd be leaving tomorrow, but he never did. He seemed to have two passions, well, to me anyway, which were playing a motorcycle racing game on his phone and pornography. And as Carlos and Paco talked, they realised they'd met years earlier while sleeping under the same bridge somewhere in Spain. And for both Carlos and Paco, hygiene didn't exist. And to find out that both Paco and Carlos hadn't showered for over 3 months when they arrived at La Casa, even David was a little surprised. And now we were 6. And I wondered how this little group would interact with each other, because living in a group like this, it only works smoothly when you think of others. So far, I'd noticed that Carlos, Paco and Francis only thought of themselves, and when there was new food on the table, it was quickly snatched up by them. But considering Carlos and Paco's hobo lifestyle, it would seem understandable. But Francis? To me, he was just a self-centred, self-absorbed person who thought of nobody but himself. And I'd seen right through him from the start. He annoyed me on several different occasions, and came extremely close to being hit really hard, but I always managed to refrain myself. And then on several different nights, around 3-4 o'clock in the morning, he'd shuffle through the gravel of the goat shed close to my head while I slept. He didn't try to be quiet or distance himself from me. I felt he did it on purpose, so I didn't give him the satisfaction of thinking he'd woken me up. I never reacted. And after he went back to bed, I would quietly slip outside to calm down, often ending up by the dying fire in the shack, and sometimes the other guys would still be up too. I told David that the next time he does it, I'll hit him. Well, the next day, David found a tent from somewhere and erected it for me under the lean-to. From then on, I slept outside in a 3-man Everest tent, looking onto the garden and out towards the Camino, between Carlos's makeshift tent at one end and Paco's decathlon tent at the other. David was also getting tired of Francis's pressuring people, himself included. And Paco? After Paco showed everybody how much he had in his wallet, which was a big mistake, Francis was on him all the time. Tune in next week for part 2 and find out if Carlos and Paco ever have a shower, and will Paco ever stop watching porn, and will I hit Francis? All these questions and more will be answered in next week's episode, and next week I have a real rant, so don't miss it. Part 2 next week. Thanks for listening. Well, that's all for this week, folks. And please remember, the same road can be travelled 1,000 different ways, so get out there and make it your own. Until next week.